Racist cop humiliates and arrests female black judge. Karma hits him when, late in the evening, as the sun dipped behind the tall buildings of the city, Judge Angela Williams finished her long day in court. She was a woman known for her intelligence, calm nature, and deep sense of justice. Every day, she listened to arguments, studied evidence, and made decisions that changed people's lives. To many in her community, she was not just a judge but a symbol of hope and fairness. That evening, she was tired yet peaceful. She stepped into her car, placed her briefcase on the seat beside her, and started her drive home. The streets were quiet, with just a few cars moving in the cool night air. She turned on soft music to ease her mind. Angela always looked forward to these small moments of peace after long hours of hearings and trials. As she drove through the neighborhood, she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it might be an emergency vehicle passing by, but soon she realized the police car was signaling for her to pull over. She calmly slowed her car and parked at the side of the road. She wondered why she was being stopped. She hadn't been speeding, and she always followed traffic laws carefully. A police officer stepped out of the patrol car. His boots hit the ground firmly, and his face carried a look of authority mixed with impatience. Angela rolled down her window politely, waiting to hear the reason for the stop. "License and registration," the officer demanded sharply, without offering a greeting or explanation. Angela kept her tone calm and respectful. "Of course, officer," she replied, reaching for her purse to retrieve her documents. She handed them over with a slight smile, trying to ease the tension she sensed in his voice. But the officer didn't seem interested in her polite manner. He studied her documents quickly, then looked at her with suspicion. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. Angela, still composed, shook her head gently. "No, officer. I wasn't aware that I did anything wrong. Could you please tell me?" Instead of answering clearly, the officer leaned closer, his tone growing sharper. "You were driving in a way that caught my attention. People like you think you can do whatever you want on the road." His words stung, not because Angela had done anything wrong, but because of the way he emphasized "people like you." She understood what he meant, but she chose not to react harshly. She knew that raising her voice or showing anger would only make things worse. "I assure you, officer, I was within the speed limit and obeying all traffic signals," she said firmly but politely. The officer frowned, as if her calmness irritated him even more. "Step out of the car," he ordered suddenly. Angela was taken aback. There was no reason for such a demand, yet she obeyed. She unbuckled her seat belt and stepped out gracefully, holding her head high. By now, a couple of bystanders across the street had started noticing what was happening. They whispered among themselves, surprised at how the situation was escalating. The officer circled her car, looking inside as though searching for trouble. He then returned to Angela, standing just inches away, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "You think just because you dress nice and drive a clean car, you're above the law?" Angela felt the weight of his words. She wanted to tell him that she was not only a law-abiding citizen but also someone who had dedicated her life to upholding justice. Yet she chose to stay quiet. Her silence was not weakness but strength. She knew that sometimes dignity was louder than anger. The officer, however, misread her silence. He took it as defiance. "Answer me when I'm talking to you," he barked. Angela looked him in the eye, her voice calm but steady. "Officer, with respect, I have answered your questions. I would like to know the reason for this stop." Her poise only seemed to frustrate him more. He gestured at her car. "Your tail light looks suspicious. Maybe it's broken. Maybe you've been drinking. Who knows?" His words were vague, without proof, but he spoke them with authority, as if hoping something would stick. The bystanders watching began recording the scene on their phones. They saw a woman who stood tall and respectful, yet was being treated with suspicion and rudeness. Some shook their heads, whispering, "She didn't do anything. Why is he talking to her like that?" Angela noticed the people watching, but she remained focused. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had faced tougher situations in courtrooms filled with tension. If she could stay composed there, she could stay composed here. The officer wasn't finished. He moved closer, his tone now openly disrespectful. "You better not try to act smart with me. I can take you in right now if I feel like it." Angela's heart pounded, not out of fear for herself, but because she realized how unfairly she was being treated. She thought of countless stories she had heard from people who came before her court, stories of being stopped for no reason, of being judged by appearance rather than actions. Now, she was living that same story. Still, she chose not to reveal her identity. She could have spoken the words that would change everything, "I am Judge Angela Williams." But she held back. She wanted to see how far this officer was willing to go. More importantly, she wanted to hold on to her dignity without pulling rank or power. The officer called for backup on his radio, speaking as though he had caught a dangerous criminal. Angela stood silently, her hands folded in front of her, her calm presence contrasting with his growing aggression. Minutes felt like hours. The flashing lights continued to reflect on the nearby buildings, drawing more attention. The bystanders whispered louder now, their voices carrying disbelief. Some said, "She looks like a professional woman. Why is he treating her like that?" Others simply shook their heads in silence. Angela looked at the stars above, steadying her thoughts. She reminded herself of the truth she always believed: injustice may rise for a moment, but it never lasts forever. What mattered most was how she responded. She knew her calmness was not just for herself but for every pair of eyes watching. The officer finally returned, looking at her with narrowed eyes. "We'll see what you're really hiding," he said, almost as if he wanted her to make a mistake. But Angela did not break. She stood there, her quiet strength shining brighter than his authority. Deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of a storm that would soon turn against the very man who thought he held all the power. And in that tense night air, as the flashing lights kept dancing and the whispers of witnesses grew louder, Angela held her ground. What she didn't know yet was that this moment, this encounter, would soon become a turning point, not just in her life, but in the life of the officer who believed he could humiliate her without consequence. The night air grew heavier as Judge Angela Williams stood quietly beside her car, the blue and red lights still flashing across the street. The officer paced around as if searching for a reason to justify his actions. He had already asked for her license and registration, checked them, and found nothing suspicious. Yet his eyes burned with a determination to prove her wrong, to prove that she was guilty of something. Angela stayed composed, her hands resting gently in front of her. Inside, she felt a swirl of emotions: confusion, sadness, and disbelief, but none of that showed on her face. She had spent years in courtrooms watching people lose their tempers. She knew better than anyone that patience was a shield in moments of tension. The officer finally stopped pacing and faced her again. His jaw tightened, and his voice rose above the quiet of the street. "You're acting strange. You're not answering me the way you should. Step further away from the car." Angela obeyed without protest. She stepped back calmly, her head held high. A couple of bystanders had moved closer, keeping their phones pointed at the scene. Their voices grew louder now, though still cautious. "She didn't do anything. Why's he treating her like this?" The officer seemed aware of the small crowd forming, but instead of calming down, he grew more defensive. His voice carried even louder now, almost as if he wanted to show control. "You're resisting my instructions. Don't make me repeat myself." Angela looked directly into his eyes. "Officer, I am following every instruction you give me. I am not resisting." Please tell me clearly what I have done wrong. Her calmness only seemed to frustrate him more. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs from his belt and held them up for everyone to see. The crowd gasped. You're under arrest for resisting lawful orders, he declared firmly. Angela blinked in surprise. For the first time, her heart raced faster. Arrest? For what? She had followed every command. She had spoken respectfully. She had not raised her voice, not moved without permission, not even questioned his authority beyond a polite request for explanation. Yet here she was, being told she was going to jail. Officer, she began slowly, I have not resisted you in any way. You have no reason to. Enough, he cut her off. His tone was sharp, almost theatrical, as if he wanted the onlookers to believe she was dangerous. He reached for her arm. Angela did not pull away. Instead, she lifted her chin and allowed him to place the cold handcuffs around her wrists. The metal pressed into her skin, but she didn't flinch. She reminded herself, this is temporary. Truth will speak louder than this moment. The crowd murmured in disbelief. A woman in the group said aloud, she's not resisting. Why is he doing this? Another man shook his head and whispered, this doesn't feel right. She looks like a professional lady, not a criminal. Phones recorded every second. Faces showed shock, pity, and quiet anger. Angela noticed them but kept her focus steady. She refused to let humiliation bend her spirit. As the officer tightened the handcuffs, he leaned closer and muttered words that only she could hear, you thought you could play smart. Now you'll see what happens when you cross me. Angela's heart sank at his tone. It wasn't about justice, it wasn't about law, it was about his pride, his ego, his desire to show power. She felt the weight of the moment not only for herself but for everyone watching. He guided her toward the police car. The cuffs clinked with every step, echoing in her ears. She walked gracefully despite the discomfort, as if refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Before placing her inside, he turned to the crowd and said loudly, this is what happens when someone refuses to listen to lawful orders. The bystanders exchanged glances. They knew what they had seen was not resistance, but they also knew arguing in that moment would change nothing. Instead, their cameras kept rolling, capturing every movement, every word. Angela sat in the back of the police car, the seat cold beneath her. She took a slow breath, closing her eyes for a moment. The humiliation was real, but so was her strength. She told herself, I will not let this define me. I know who I am. The truth will come. The officer drove toward the station, his expression proud, as though he had accomplished something great. Angela looked out the window, watching the city lights blur past. She thought of the courtroom where she usually sat, listening to stories of injustice. Tonight, she was no longer the judge but the one experiencing it. The irony was painful, yet she found a strange sense of clarity. At the station, the officer pulled her out and led her inside. Other officers glanced up in surprise. Some looked confused, others curious. She was dressed professionally, her calm posture unlike that of someone who had caused trouble. What's the charge? One of the officers at the desk asked. Resisting orders, the arresting officer replied quickly. Angela stood silently as the others processed the information. She noticed the uncertain glances exchanged among them. It was as if they weren't convinced. Her dignity, her composed expression, and her professional appearance made it difficult for them to believe she had done anything wrong. Still, protocol followed. Her details were noted down. The coldness of the process was something Angela had witnessed countless times from the judge's bench, but experiencing it firsthand felt different. Every form, every step, carried a weight of humiliation. Yet she did not argue. She answered questions politely, kept her voice steady, and moved gracefully even with the handcuffs still pressing into her wrists. Her calmness stood in sharp contrast to the arresting officer's harsh demeanor. One officer, while filling out paperwork, gave her a searching look. "Ma'am, do you have someone you'd like to call?" he asked gently. Angela nodded slowly. "Yes, I will make a call." Her voice was calm, but inside she thought of how unbelievable this moment was. A judge, respected for her fairness, standing here like a criminal. But she also knew something powerful: the truth always comes out, and when it does, it cannot be stopped. By now, videos of her arrest had already begun spreading through social media. People who had recorded the scene uploaded it almost immediately. Within minutes, the comments grew. "This woman didn't resist at all. Why did he arrest her? She stayed calm the whole time." Unknowingly, the officer who thought he had won a battle had already planted the seeds of his downfall. The very crowd he had ignored was becoming the voice of truth. Angela, still in the station, didn't know yet how far the story was spreading. But she carried herself as if she did. With her quiet strength, she stood taller than the man who had tried to humiliate her. She believed that patience was not just endurance, it was also a form of silent resistance. And in that cold, bright station, surrounded by officers who didn't fully understand what was unfolding, Angela waited. She knew the night would not end here. She knew this was only another step in a story that would soon turn against the one who had placed her in chains without reason. Angela stood quietly in the brightly lit police station, her wrists still bound by the handcuffs. She could feel the coldness of the metal digging into her skin, but she chose not to complain. Instead, she stood tall, her calm expression hiding the storm of emotions inside her. The officer who had arrested her walked with confidence, handing over the paperwork as though he had made an important catch. His voice carried pride as he repeated the charge: resisting lawful orders. The desk sergeant raised an eyebrow. He looked from the officer to Angela, and then back at the paperwork. Something about the situation did not sit right with him. Angela did not look like someone who had caused trouble. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her clothes neat, her voice polite. Still, the sergeant did not question it further. Protocol demanded they process the arrest first. Angela answered the basic questions calmly. Name. Address. Occupation. When she said the word judge in response to her occupation, the officer filling out the form froze for a moment. He lifted his eyes and studied her face more closely. Judge? Did you say you're a judge? Angela nodded slowly. Yes. I serve as a judge in the county courthouse. A silence filled the room for a moment. The officers nearby exchanged quick glances. Some looked surprised, others uneasy. The arresting officer's face, however, grew stiff. He quickly cut in before anyone else could ask further questions. Anyone can claim to be a judge, he said firmly, trying to brush off her words. We don't know who she really is. That's why I brought her in. But doubt had already started to form in the room. Judges were well known in the city, and many officers had at least heard of Angela Williams. Some had even seen her in court before. One officer at the back whispered softly to another, "Isn't that Judge Williams? She looks familiar." Angela remained silent. She knew the truth did not need to be shouted. The truth always carried its own power. As the paperwork continued, one officer decided to check. He quietly searched the court database on his computer. Within moments, Angela's profile appeared: Honorable Judge Angela Williams, County Court. Her photograph, her achievements, and her position were all there, plain and undeniable. The officer's eyes widened. He turned to his colleagues, lowering his voice but unable to hide the shock. She's telling the truth. She really is a judge. The news spread across the room like a ripple in water. Heads turned, whispers grew louder, and eyes shifted toward the arresting officer. His face flushed, but he stood stubbornly, trying to maintain control. Angela's calm voice broke the silence. I told you the truth. I am Judge Angela Williams. I was driving home after court when I was stopped. The sergeant now looked directly at the arresting officer. His tone grew stern. Did you know who you were bringing in? The officer hesitated. No, sir. She was acting suspicious, and she refused to cooperate. She did not refuse anything, another officer interrupted boldly. She was calm the whole time. Look at her. Does she look like someone resisting arrest? The arresting officer's face grew redder. He tried to defend himself, but the murmurs around the station grew louder. The authority he had shown earlier was slipping away, replaced by doubt and quiet judgment from his own colleagues. Angela stood silently, watching everything unfold. She didn't need to argue. Every second that passed revealed the truth on its own. Just then, the phone at the desk rang sharply. The sergeant answered, listening carefully. His expression grew serious, and then he nodded. Yes, sir. Understood. He hung up and turned to the room. That was the chief, he said. He's on his way here. The room grew tense. The chief of police rarely came down to the station personally, but news of a judge being arrested had already reached him. The arresting officer's confidence faltered for the first time. He shifted uneasily, avoiding everyone's eyes. Within minutes, the chief walked in. His presence filled the room with authority. He was a tall man with years of service behind him, respected by his team. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Angela, standing with her wrists still cuffed. Judge Williams, he asked, his voice heavy with surprise. Angela gave a polite nod. Yes, Chief. That is correct. The chief's face darkened as he turned sharply toward the arresting officer. What is the meaning of this? The officer stammered. Sir, she was resisting orders, and I resisting orders, the chief cut him off. Do you have evidence? Witnesses? Anything other than your word? The officer hesitated, his mouth opening and closing without answers. The chief motioned to one of the other officers. Remove the cuffs immediately. Angela's wrists were freed, and the cold weight finally lifted. She rubbed her wrists gently, but her posture remained strong. She did not look angry. Instead, her eyes carried a quiet disappointment, as though she had seen this kind of behavior too many times before. The chief lowered his voice respectfully as he spoke to her. Your Honor, I am deeply sorry for what has happened. This should never have occurred. You will not be treated this way under my watch. Angela gave a small nod. Thank you, Chief. I only hope this moment is not brushed aside. It is not about me, it is about the principle of justice. If this can happen to someone in my position, imagine how often it happens to others who cannot defend themselves. Her words carried weight. The officers in the room felt the truth of them. They knew she was right. Many had seen questionable arrests before, but seeing it happen to a judge made the reality impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, outside the station, the videos of Angela's arrest had spread widely. On social media, people were sharing the clips, outraged by what they saw. This is Judge Williams, one post said. Look at how she was treated for no reason. Another post read, if this can happen to a judge, what hope do ordinary people have? By the time the chief escorted Angela out of the station, reporters had already gathered outside. Microphones, cameras, and flashing lights surrounded the entrance. Questions flew from every direction. Judge Williams, what happened tonight? Do you plan to take legal action? What do you want the public to know? Angela paused for a moment at the top of the steps. She could have expressed her anger. She could have demanded punishment right there. But instead, she spoke calmly, her voice clear and steady. What happened to me tonight was unjust. I was pulled over without reason, spoken to with disrespect, and arrested though I followed every instruction. I do not share this to seek sympathy. I share this because it reflects a larger problem. Many people experience this treatment daily but do not have the privilege or position I do to make their voices heard. This is not about one officer and one judge. This is about fairness, respect, and the way authority must be used responsibly. Her words spread quickly across every news channel, every social media platform, and every community discussion. People listened. People agreed. And people began to ask questions about the officer who had humiliated her. Inside the station, the officer sat at his desk, his confidence completely shattered. He had thought he was showing power, but now he saw the truth. His actions were not a display of strength, but of weakness. And the world was watching. Angela returned home that night, exhausted but unbroken. She knew the story was not over. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences were still to come. And as she sat quietly in her living room, sipping a glass of water, she whispered to herself, "Justice always finds its way." The following morning, the city buzzed with conversations about Judge Angela Williams. Everywhere people turned at bus stops, in coffee shops, in offices the same story echoed. Videos of her arrest had spread like wildfire, viewed millions of times overnight. The image of a calm, dignified judge being handcuffed on the street had left people stunned. News anchors replayed the footage again and again, their voices filled with disbelief. "This is Judge Angela Williams," one anchor said firmly. "She was pulled over without reason, spoken to with disrespect, and handcuffed despite following every instruction." The question many are asking today is, if this can happen to a judge, how safe are ordinary citizens? The community responded with outrage. Messages of support poured in for Angela. Letters, emails, and phone calls came to her office. People she had once helped in court now sent words of encouragement, telling her to stay strong. "You gave me a fair chance when no one else would," one message read. "Now it's time for us to stand with you." Meanwhile, the officer who had arrested her woke up to a very different reality. When he turned on his phone that morning, he was greeted not by silence but by hundreds of notifications. His name was trending online. The videos showed his every word, his every action, and people were not holding back their criticism. Unprofessional. Abuse of power. How can someone like him wear a badge? Comments flooded in, and the officer felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had thought the night before would end quietly, that no one would question his authority. But now, the world was questioning everything about him. By noon, his face appeared on the news. His department had already announced an internal investigation into his conduct. A press release stated, "We are aware of the incident involving Judge Angela Williams. This matter is being taken very seriously. The actions of the officer in question are under review." The chief of police, who had personally witnessed the truth at the station, made a public statement as well. "We hold all officers to the highest standard of professionalism. No one is above the law, but no one is beneath dignity either. What happened last night raises serious concerns, and steps will be taken to ensure accountability." Angela watched the news from her living room. She sat quietly, her face calm. She had expected the storm to come, but she did not celebrate it. She knew the pain of humiliation could not be erased by headlines. Yet she also knew this was bigger than her. The attention now shone on a deeper issue, one that too many people had faced silently. Her phone rang constantly that day. Friends, colleagues, and fellow judges called to express support. Some urged her to press charges immediately. Others told her to let the investigation play out. Angela listened politely to each of them, but she had already decided, she would let the truth speak louder than her anger. The officer, however, found himself isolated. Fellow officers who once laughed and joked with him at the station now avoided eye contact. Whispers followed him in the hallways. Some openly questioned his actions. "Why would you arrest her for nothing?" one colleague asked. "Did you forget who she was? Or did you just not care?" He tried to defend himself. She was acting strange. She was too calm. It felt like she was hiding something. But his excuses only made him sound weaker. Everyone had seen the videos. Everyone had heard Angela's calm voice. His words held no weight against the evidence. Soon, older complaints against him began to surface. Citizens who had once filed reports about his behavior now came forward again, their voices louder this time. Stories of rudeness, unfair stops, and unnecessary aggression painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. The investigation moved quickly. Media outlets camped outside the police station, waiting for updates. The officer's name appeared on every headline, not as a hero but as a symbol of misconduct. For Angela, life felt different as well. Wherever she went, people recognized her. Strangers approached her in the grocery store to thank her for staying calm. Young people told her she inspired them. Parents said they showed the video to their children as a lesson in dignity and strength. Angela accepted the kind words with humility. She reminded everyone she spoke to, "This is not about me alone. It is about the principle that no one should be treated unfairly. Authority must always walk hand in hand with responsibility." Days turned into weeks, and the officer's situation grew worse. The department suspended him while the investigation continued. Without his badge and uniform, he felt stripped of his identity. The power he once carried on the streets was gone. People avoided him in public, whispering about him as he passed by. He tried to hold on to his pride, but deep inside, he knew the truth. He had made a mistake, not just a small one, but one that revealed his true character in front of the entire world. One evening, sitting alone in his apartment, he turned on the television. A news channel was airing an interview with Judge Angela Williams. She sat calmly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her voice steady and warm. "I do not hate the officer who arrested me," she said gently. "But I do believe his actions were wrong. Justice is not about revenge, it is about accountability. When authority is misused, it must be corrected not only for the person who suffered, but for the future of everyone who may come after. My hope is that this situation reminds us all that respect must be given to every person, no matter their background." Her words pierced through the officer more than any punishment ever could. She was not shouting for him to be destroyed. She was not celebrating his downfall. Instead, she was teaching the very lesson he had ignored: respect, fairness, and humility. The investigation concluded soon after. The report stated clearly that the officer had abused his authority, that his reasons for the arrest were baseless, and that his behavior had damaged the trust between the police and the community. As a result, he was dismissed from the department. His badge was taken away, his career in law enforcement effectively over. The announcement made headlines across the country: "Officer who arrested Judge Angela Williams fired for misconduct." When Angela heard the news, she felt no joy, no satisfaction in his downfall. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, "Justice has spoken." For her, the real victory was not that he had lost his job, but that the world had seen the truth. His arrogance had been replaced with accountability. His pride had been humbled. And his attempt to humiliate her had turned into the very reason for his own fall. The community, however, saw her as a symbol of strength. Rallies were held, conversations grew louder, and reforms were demanded. People spoke not just about Angela, but about every ordinary person who had faced similar treatment. Her calm response had opened a door to a bigger discussion. And somewhere, sitting alone with the silence of his mistakes, the officer finally understood what she had meant: respect is not a gift, it is a responsibility. And when misused, it has the power to destroy the very person who ignores it. Weeks had passed since the night Judge Angela Williams had been humiliated on the roadside. The incident had shaken the city, but it had also awakened something powerful. People were no longer whispering about injustice, they were speaking about it loudly, demanding answers and calling for change. Angela, though personally affected, carried herself with grace through it all. She continued her work in court as if nothing had changed, yet everyone who saw her now looked at her differently. Lawyers, citizens, and even her fellow judges admired her for the dignity she had shown. In the courtroom, she remained fair and steady, reminding people that her role was never about her pride but about justice itself. One morning, Angela walked into the courthouse and found a crowd waiting at the entrance. They weren't there for protests or complaints, but for support. People held signs with words like respect, fairness, justice. Others simply stood quietly, their presence a symbol of unity. When Angela stepped out of her car, they clapped not out of pity, but out of admiration. She raised her hand gently, smiling at them. "Thank you," she said softly. "Your voices are strong, but remember, this is not about me. This is about making sure no one else goes through what I did. Let's continue to stand for fairness together." Her words touched hearts, and the crowd nodded. They understood she was not turning her story into personal fame. Instead, she was using it to shine a light on a problem that many had ignored for too long. Meanwhile, the officer who had arrested her struggled with his new reality. Without his badge, he felt like a man lost at sea. He had built his identity around his uniform and authority, but now both were gone. Every time he stepped outside, he saw people whispering. Every time he turned on the television, he heard his name linked to disgrace. The very act he thought would show his strength had destroyed him. He had wanted to put Angela down, but in doing so, he had lifted her even higher in the eyes of the world. That was karma, silent, powerful, and undeniable. Angela, however, did not dwell on his downfall. She believed justice was never about revenge. Instead, she focused on what could be learned from the situation. At schools, universities, and community events, she began to speak publicly about her experience. At one gathering, she stood before a group of young students. Their curious eyes followed her every word. "The lesson I learned," she said, "is that dignity is more powerful than anger. That night, I could have shouted, I could have fought, I could have used my position to defend myself. But I chose calmness. And that calmness showed the truth better than anger ever could." One student raised his hand nervously. "Judge Williams, were you scared?" Angela paused thoughtfully before answering. "Yes, I was. I am human, just like you. I was scared, not for my safety alone, but because I knew what it represented. If it could happen to me, how often was it happening to others without anyone watching? But fear is natural. What matters is what we do despite our fear. That is where strength comes from." Her words were met with applause, but more importantly, they planted seeds of courage in young hearts. The media continued to follow her story, but she never sought attention. She used every microphone and every camera as a tool not for herself, but for her community. "We must remember," she said in one interview, "that power is a responsibility. Authority must serve, not control. The badge, the robe, the title, none of these make us better than another human being. They are tools to protect fairness, nothing more." Her humility made her even more respected. People compared her calmness to a lighthouse, steady even in storms, guiding others with quiet strength. As for the officer, he eventually faced lawsuits from people who had complained about him in the past. With no badge to protect him, the truth of his actions came out in full. Every story, every complaint, every video became another stone in the wall that surrounded him. He had once carried pride like armor, but now he carried regret like a heavy chain. And in the silence of his regrets, he finally understood what Angela had tried to show with her composure: arrogance destroys itself, but dignity builds a legacy. Months later, a large community forum was organized in the city to discuss trust between citizens and law enforcement. Angela was invited as the keynote speaker. The hall was filled with people, students, leaders, officers, and ordinary citizens. The air was heavy with expectation. When Angela stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. She looked across the crowd and began, her voice gentle but firm. "Many of you know what happened to me," she said. "But tonight, I don't want to talk about my humiliation or the mistakes of one man. Tonight, I want to talk about us. About what justice means. Justice is not revenge. Justice is not pride. Justice is respect, equality, and truth." She paused, letting the words sink in. When authority forgets its responsibility, it becomes dangerous. But when authority remembers it exists to serve, it becomes a blessing. That night, I was treated unfairly. But because people recorded it, because people spoke up, the truth came out. Imagine how many times it does not. That is why each of us has a role. Not just to demand justice for ourselves, but to ensure it for others. The hall erupted in applause. Some people stood, clapping with tears in their eyes. Others nodded firmly, inspired to carry her message forward. Angela ended her speech with words that would be remembered long after: "Power can put someone in handcuffs. But only dignity can set people free." From that night on, Angela's story was no longer just about her arrest. It became a lesson, a movement, a reminder of what respect and patience could achieve. Schools taught about it, newspapers quoted it, and communities carried it in their hearts. And so, the judge who had once been humiliated on the roadside became a symbol of grace, strength, and justice. The officer who had tried to break her stood as a warning of what happens when pride overtakes responsibility. Angela never sought to destroy him. She only sought to show the truth. And the truth, as always, had spoken louder than anger, louder than humiliation, louder than fear. In the end, Angela returned each day to her courtroom, sitting behind the bench with the same calm eyes she had carried that night. But now, those eyes held something more, the knowledge that dignity in the face of injustice is the strongest judgment of all. And those who entered her courtroom, whether guilty or innocent, rich or poor, black or white, knew they were standing before not just a judge of the law, but a judge of character, a woman who had lived through injustice and shown the world how to rise above it. Justice had found its way, as it always does.